As much as we're talking about religion in this year's presidential election, I want to go on record saying something that might seem a little out of place considering where we are and who I am. But even if Jesus of Nazareth were running for elected office this year, I would not endorse him. While I would certainly be glad to have a president who would not send our armies in to occupy foreign nations on trumped-up charges or exaggerated threats, I would still want a president that would at least be willing to use military force to defend our borders, and I don't think Jesus would. While I think that our current policies that end up imprisoning a huge portion of our population, we imprison a larger percentage of our population than communist China does, and I think it's frequently immoral, wrong-headed, bad policy-wise in criminal justice, bad economically. Still, I'm pretty sure that if Jesus was president, he would just unlock all the doors and tell everyone to go and sin no more. And I know some of those people in prison, and I don't think that technique would work. Moses and Muhammad were not just religious leaders, they were also heads of state. Confucius was a government official. Even the Buddha gave direct leadership to a monastic community. Jesus never did any of those things. Jesus was more like a speaker at an Occupy protest. He had complaints about social injustice, and he had very, very high values for social ethics. But Jesus never offered a workable program. Telling people to sell all they own and give it to the poor is a fabulous idea. Just imagine how if Bill Gates or Warren Buffett actually sold everything they own and gave it to the poor, it would make the entire world really different for at least a week, maybe 2 weeks. But if we all did it, if we all sold everything that we own and gave it to the poor, then the world economy would collapse. There would be no more agriculture, there would be no manufacturing, there would be no construction, there would be no health care. As a program, it doesn't work. My high school history teacher, Mr. Brown, liked to say, socialism is based on idealism, capitalism is based on realism. And as a follower of the teachings of Jesus, I'm convinced that it is wrong for some people to live in mansions while other people still live under bridges. I'm outraged that some dine like monarchs every day while others are rooting through garbage in dumpsters trying to find something to eat. I think it's really wrong that some people face old age and illness with the confidence that they're going to be housed, they're going to be cared for, and they're going to receive the best medicine that technology can provide, while the majority of people watch their advancing years coming towards them with fear and dread. Now, if Republicans and Democrats were actually virtuous, if the parties as a party had virtue as a core value, then their sole concerns would be very similar. Their techniques would be different, but their central core belief would be a desire to provide the greatest good for the largest number of people. What disgusts most of us about partisan politics is that it often appears that each party's core value is to either retain or to gain power. Capitalist countries in the West, I believe, need to be infused with some of the idealism of socialism. Just as socialist countries in the East are embracing a great deal of the pragmatism of Western capitalist economies. What we who are inspired by the idealism of Jesus and Moses and Muhammad and Buddha and Confucius hope for is that capitalists and socialists will figure out a way to decrease human suffering, to give housing to everyone, to make health care both effective and available to everyone, and to give people as much freedom as we can give them without exposing them to too much risk, particularly risk of violence. Jesus didn't have a workable plan, but he sure had a great goal. In our reading from Acts today, we see Luke's account of a little experiment in community ownership of property. The Easter event, according to Luke, had such a huge impact on the early church that at least for a short time, there was a collapse of ego boundaries. And we experience this in smaller ways throughout our lives. The old wedding vows, when you put the ring on one another's finger and say, "I plight thee my troth." It was a statement that what was mine is now yours. All of my estate, all of my holdings, all of my belongings, anything that accrues to me is now also yours. That when you fall in love with someone to that degree, the presumption is that there's a collapse of ego boundaries, that the two of you will now share things equally. Most of us who are parents have experienced that there is no sense in which there is a mine and my children's. That I was doing some work at the house this week and I had my lunch in the refrigerator. My daughter came home from a break from work, went in the house and ate my lunch. And I didn't know that until I came in from mowing the grass, that my lunch had been eaten by my daughter. But if any of you had done that, I would have been angry. But there's a collapse of ego boundary that, okay, she ate my lunch, I do without lunch, that's okay because she's my kid. There's a difference there in those kinds of relationships. What Luke is describing happened to the early church was that the Easter event was so profound that everyone became family. Everyone became like parent and child or spouse, that there was no one that said, "I have enough and it sucks to be you that you don't have enough." Everyone shared immediately. But a discerning biblical historian might note that a very few years later, when Paul is writing his letters to the Corinthian church and Galatian church, that he's going around and taking up a collection to support the poor of Jerusalem. Now, I don't know if you want to draw a straight historical line, but I think there is at least a case to be made that their initial selling everything they owned and sharing it with everyone was economically disastrous. They ended up needing to be given charity to support them after they had lost all of their assets. I'm not sure that's a fair historical thing to draw, but it does make sense that if you take Jesus seriously at the sell all you own and give it to the poor, that even Jesus could have conducted his ministry if some of his adherents, some of his supporters, hadn't had jobs and fields. Somebody had to grow food, someone had to feed him, someone had to help take care of him. What we want as then followers of Jesus is not for everyone to sell all they own and give it to the poor and we all become ascetic monks who live in the forest. What we want is for those of us who have jobs and have houses and have health insurance to use our political influence, our ideology, to help make sure that everyone else gets a job and a house and health insurance and a livable pension. I believe that on anyone's short list of the greatest threats to Western civilization in the year 2012 is the income disparity between the rich and the growing numbers of the poor people in our nation. You list all the things that we need to worry about: environment and warfare, the East-West struggles, Islamic fundamentalists. I believe above any of those things, of primary concern to the survival of our civilization is the income disparity between the rich and the poor. And that is why last fall I put on a Guy Fawkes costume and stood with other Occupy demonstrators. But even in our very first event in Springfield, there was a guy there with a megaphone, those of you that were there may remember, who was spouting this Glenn Beck-style ideology that we all need to get rid of our currency and trade only in gold. I mean, he ruined the event for me. And I have tried to talk with this guy at subsequent events, and I'm going to bring to bear all of my graduate school education and pastoral counseling and just say he is completely nuts. That's just, it's not just that he's got bad information or he's politically ill-informed. He's just crazy. But the Occupy encampments around the country have oftentimes included elements of a Woodstock type gathering with open use of illegal drugs, lots of sex and irresponsible conduct, so much so that it's hard to tell the difference between them and a Secret Service deployment in Colombia at this point. But I digress. We will focus on things, litter left behind when the Occupy protest is dispersed, or even that moral midget of a policeman who sprayed military-grade pepper spray directly in the eyes of peaceful protesters sitting on a sidewalk. I mean, even the instructions on the can say not to use within 8 feet of a person. And this guy is going up to college students sitting on a sidewalk and spraying them right in the eyes. There's not many times that I'm motivated for revenge, but I'm glad I wasn't there that day, or there might have been a fracas. We would still be just writing letters to each other, I'm afraid, if I'd been there that day. The issue is not the conduct of the protesters or the conduct of the police. The issue is income disparity, and that it is choking the future out of our coming generation through unbridled greed and irresponsible economic policies. And while I, like Jesus, am not an economist, I'm not a political scientist, but I emphatically agree with Gandhi, who said that there is more than enough for the world's needs, but there is not enough for the world's greed. Where the idealism of socialism and the pragmatism of capitalism intersect is where the values of spiritual leaders and the authority of politicians must overlap, so that none of us are willing to tolerate circumstances where gluttony and hunger are supposed to coexist politely side by side. As President John Kennedy once said, those who oppose peaceful social transformation will make violent social change necessary. Americans can be very pig-headed. Most nations of the world figured out how to end slavery without having a civil war, but not us. Most social change for us comes down to something as violent as a civil war or the civil rights movement. Western European countries have managed to blend their economic systems to make healthcare and housing available to everyone, and even China is blending their economic systems to raise the standard of living of their population. At a recent economic conference, a Chinese official was asked by a reporter if China was not abandoning their commitment to communism in this global market. And this official thought for a moment and replied, "China will do whatever we must do to grow our economy, and whatever we do, we will call it socialism." That may seem a bit hypocritical, but I like the idea. We who are motivated by the compassion of a spiritual life desire to see the greatest amount of good for the largest number of people. And you can call it whatever you want to call it. I just want to get to the point that we don't have a tolerance of people having to live under bridges or go through dumpsters to find food. I will never endorse a candidate. I will never endorse a political party. But I will say this: anyone who does not have a plan to elevate the living circumstances of the poor, anyone who doesn't have as a goal providing health care to everyone who is sick, anyone who doesn't have a vision of how to eradicate hunger, homelessness, and unemployment, anyone who is not driven by a passionate desire to protect vulnerable children and the vulnerable elderly, that person does not have the moral character to justify holding public office. And neither the threat of crucifixion nor any amount of pepper spray will ever make the people of faith give up their hope for justice.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.